Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 153, The Mystics of Islam by Reynold Nicholson, early 20th century, 125 pages, so it's a bit longer than some of these works are. In its initial format, it's closer to 200. It's funny how that works with books of that era. We're talking like from the 1880s or so to through the 1920s. The font size is considerably different. The margins usually inordinate, and the header and footer have a lot of space. And then the space between lines tends to be like double. I don't know why they wrote their books that way. I guess they did it because they wanted to cover topical educational subjects, and they wanted people to be able, I don't know, put notes in or scribble around in their books like they were a workbook. No, but it's a very good book on Sufism, and it includes things like, for instance, within certain sub-schools, we're talking about the idea that the ultimate goal is sort of self-dissolution within the mystic tradition counterpart to Islam, which is semi-separate even to this day to some degree. It's counted under the general header of Islam, but it's not the same as like the Wahhabi tradition or mainline Shia or anything like that. It tends to be more geared towards certain ecstatic rites. For instance, the whirling dervishes. The idea is it's a very ceremonial thing, these dervishes, highly religious people. They'll get together and they'll start sort of whirling around, sort of characteristic dance, and they're sort of attempting to dissolve themselves away and unite all together with God. And another thing is, and this is also within certain sub-schools, you have the concept that because they're God, Allah is in everything, typically there's no fear of hell, for example. One thing that's noted by certain scholars within Sufism, hell is not to actually be feared because, their God is as well. There is no separation, and so it would be better to be connected with that Godhead and be in hell than to be disconnected and be anywhere else, like in a form of paradise. It wouldn't be there'd be no point to being in paradise if you're not sort of self-dissolving into that Godhead through these mystic rites insofar as you're able, and slowly decreasing your own impact to the point where you reunite. That is, that it's a fallen state to be separate at all. It's not so much reincarnation or the movement over time towards nirvana. It's a spiritual attempt to sort of reconnect with this. The concept of sort of self-denial, the concept as well as of indulgence, that is, in certain groups, you'd say, well, you're taking a vow of poverty and you're very chaste and stuff. And then in other groups, they're actually, especially earlier on before persecution by maybe more religious movements in the more organized and militaristic sense, what you get are certain groups that are actually very hedonistic, to the point of a libertine lifestyle. Say, okay, there's no reason to change your behavior. Anything you do is a part of and parcel of this all-encompassing God anyway. Evil and good, murder, birth. It doesn't really matter whether you're chaste or whether you indulge yourself. So you might as well indulge yourself because it's enjoyable to do and there's no reason not to, essentially. And if you end up in hell for it, it doesn't even matter because, again, the God is still there. And so because you are part in that presence and you no longer have a physical form in the rudimentary sense, it's going to be basically paradise. It doesn't matter if you're being licked by the flames. You'll literally just learn to enjoy it, I suppose, and dissolve yourself once you're there. It's a very, very interesting idea, and I don't believe that mainline Sufism actually stresses that. That was a smaller subgroup, but it was a libertine lifestyle that sometimes evolved among certain groups within. Generally speaking, the work doesn't actually focus as much on the whirling dervishes as I expected it to. When I first encountered the work, I'm like, oh, it's probably going to be like half of it will be about that. It's actually only one fairly short section in a chapter. Most of it is on ideas like fana, and existence versus non-existence, and almost a connection to Gnosticism, and that's actually briefly covered as well. That there is certain influence into this movement that's extra Islamic. That is, it comes from outside of Islam itself and sort of co-evolves with it over time. It's a very, very interesting work, highly recommended. There aren't many good works on this subject, and I don't think I've released any work so far, editing-wise, that had anything to do with Islam or any of its subgroups in the case of Sufism. By the way, this work may become unavailable at some point in the next 48 hours. CreateSpace has a habit of typically holding my works over. Like, because of CreateSpace's move to Amazon, they've begun checking works for copyright more. But also, oddly enough, I never actually had to okay the book file. I can never set it to the review process. It just uploaded it almost immediately. Once the files were actually physically processed, it became available and is now. I was actually surprised when it was, because usually it'll say not in stock until you okay the file. This time, I don't know, I guess their moderators okay them now, like they do the file checking to make sure that it looks okay. Which actually makes sense because, you know, on my end, if I'm looking at the electronic version, there have been cases where it's slightly different from the actual printed version. I don't know why. Like the trim on the front will be just slightly off, despite the fact that I use their template. I'm not exactly sure why. That's happened multiple times in processing, especially with KDP. So I don't know if that happens, though. I mean, it is an out of copyright work. It's public domain, but my version, it's been re-edited. Like the grammar is different, the format's different, the cover art is different, the foreword is unique, and that's how I edit my works. A lot more work going into it than simply taking a PDF off archive.org, slapping a new cover on it and uploading it as is, which some unscrupulous vendors have done, which allows, I can't even fathom how much money they must make. Because they'll have thousands and thousands of titles, even if they don't all necessarily sell well. They've got like the whole fucking archive.org library available. Like we're talking sometimes tens of thousands of editions for some of these publishing firms. They must make 6 figures a month. I mean, it must be astonishing. It must be fantastic that they can make a lifestyle doing this, and they don't even have to do any actual editing to do it. Apparently Amazon never had a problem with that. I guess they check things more rigorously now, so maybe that'll actually knock these people off because they're not hand editing, so they don't have a unique work. It's just a public domain work. So, yeah, be that as it may. So it may go down at some point. If it does, just wait a day or something. They're pretty good. They're pretty responsive at this point about making sure that things are moving smoothly. So again, a link in the description to where you can buy this work. Second and third, links to my books blogs. I sell many other edited and self-authored works there, different categories. That's about all. Peace out.